The ink stain on Eleanor Hartley's thumb had been there so long, it looked like a permanent shadow, a mark of all the words she had written but never dared to send into the world beyond her window. She sat at the small wooden desk in her bedroom above the general store in Marysville, Kansas, watching the dust devils spin down the main street in the summer heat of 1876. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains her mother had made before the fever took her 3 years ago, and Eleanor dipped her pen into the inkwell once more. This letter, like all the others, would go into the carved wooden box beneath her bed, never to be read by anyone but herself. "Dear someone," she began, as she always did. "Today I watched a hawk circle over the prairie for nearly an hour, riding the thermals with such grace that I forgot to breathe. I wonder what it sees from up there. I wonder if freedom looks different from that height, or if it is simply the absence of walls and expectations." She was 22 years old, and her father expected her to marry Gerald Preston, the banker's son who smelled of pomade and spoke only of interest rates and property values. The arrangement had been discussed over Sunday dinner for months now, always in her presence but never with her input, as if she were a piece of furniture being appraised rather than a person with thoughts and dreams of her own. Eleanor continued writing, her hand moving quickly across the paper. "Sometimes I think about just walking out into that prairie and never stopping, but that is foolish. Where would I go? What would I do? A woman alone is prey in this world, and I am nothing if not practical. So I write these letters instead, and I tell you all the things I cannot say aloud. I tell you that I want more than this. I want to see the mountains. I want to sleep under stars so thick they look like spilled salt. I want to feel something real, something that makes my heart beat the way it does when I read about adventures in far-off places." She signed it simply E and folded the paper carefully. But as she reached for the box under her bed, she heard her father calling from downstairs. She tucked the letter into her apron pocket, meaning to store it away later, and hurried down to help with the evening rush of customers. The general store was busy that evening. A cattle drive had passed through earlier in the week, and the cowhands were stocking up on supplies before heading north. Eleanor worked behind the counter, measuring out flour and coffee, wrapping purchases in brown paper, and trying not to meet the eyes of the rough men who sometimes stared at her with uncomfortable intensity. She had forgotten entirely about the letter in her pocket until she stepped outside to sweep the boardwalk just before closing. The wind had picked up, carrying the promise of rain from clouds gathering on the horizon. As she swept, the letter somehow slipped from her pocket, caught by a gust that sent it tumbling down the street like a tumbleweed. Eleanor watched it go with a mixture of horror and strange relief. Perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps the prairie would claim her words and scatter them where no one would ever piece them together. She was wrong. Thomas Yates had been riding for 3 days straight, and every bone in his body ached. He was 25, lean and sun-weathered, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of creek water. He had been working as a ranch hand for the past 7 years, ever since his parents died of cholera and left him to make his own way in the world. The work was hard but honest, and he preferred the company of horses and open sky to the crowded cities back east where he had spent his childhood. He had just hitched his horse outside the saloon in Marysville when something white caught his eye, pressed against the water trough by the wind. He reached down and picked it up, recognizing it as a letter. The paper was good quality, the handwriting neat and flowing. He should not have read it. He knew that even as his eyes moved across the first line, but he did read it. He read it standing there in the dusty street as the first fat raindrops began to fall, and something in those words struck him like a physical blow. Here was a voice that spoke to something deep in his chest, something he had thought was his alone, the loneliness, the yearning for something more, the sense that the world was bigger than the small space allotted to each person, and the frustration of being trapped in that space. He read it twice, then carefully folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He did not know who had written it, but he knew he had to find out. The rain came down harder, sending people scurrying for cover. Thomas ducked into the general store, shaking water from his hat. An older man with graying hair and a prosperous look about him stood behind the counter. "Help you?" the man asked. "Need some tobacco and maybe some hardtack if you have it," Thomas said, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light inside. Then he saw her. She was coming down the stairs from what he assumed were living quarters above, carrying a ledger book. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, pulled back in a simple style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She wore a plain blue dress with a white apron, and there was an ink stain on her thumb. When she looked up and their eyes met, Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening. "My daughter Eleanor will help you," the older man said. "I need to check the stock in the back." Eleanor approached the counter, and Thomas noticed she moved with quiet grace, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in the world. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "Tobacco," he said, then realized he was staring and forced himself to look at the shelves behind her. "And hardtack, whatever you have." She gathered the items efficiently, wrapping them in brown paper. Her hands were small but capable, and he noticed the ink stain again, a writer's hands. His heart began to beat faster. "Anything else?" she asked. He should have said no. He should have paid and left and minded his own business. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. "I found this in the street. Thought someone might be looking for it." The color drained from Eleanor's face, then rushed back in a fierce blush. She recognized her own handwriting immediately. Thank you, I must have dropped it." "Did you write it?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes not quite meeting his. "It is nothing, just foolishness." "It is not foolish," he said with such conviction that her eyes snapped up to meet his. "It is the truest thing I have read in years." They stood there for a moment, the air between them suddenly charged with something neither could name. The rain drummed on the roof, and somewhere in the back of the store, Eleanor's father moved boxes around, oblivious. "You read it?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did. I should not have, but I did. I am sorry for that." He paused, turning his hat in his hands. "But I am not sorry. I know your words now." "They were not meant for anyone," she said, but there was something in her voice, a tentative hope that made his chest ache. "Maybe they were meant for someone," Thomas said. "Maybe they were just waiting for the right person to find them." Eleanor's father came back into the room before she could respond, and the moment broke. Thomas paid for his purchases, tipped his hat to Eleanor, and left the store. But that night, in his room at the boarding house, he pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. "Dear someone," he wrote, echoing her opening. "I found your letter today, and I want you to know that I understand. I have felt that same restlessness, that same hunger for something more than the life we are given. I have seen the mountains you dream of. I have slept under those stars. And I am here to tell you that they are even more beautiful than you imagine. But they are lonely without someone to share them with. If you want to know what the hawk sees, I will tell you. If you want to talk about freedom and dreams and all the things that make your heart beat faster, I am listening. I will be your correspondent if you will have me." He signed it T, and the next morning, before he lost his courage, he went back to the general store. Eleanor was sweeping the boardwalk, and when she saw him, she went still. "I wrote you a letter," he said without preamble. "A response to yours. I would like to give it to you if that would be all right." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw fear and longing warring in her eyes. Finally, she held out her hand. He placed the folded paper in her palm, and their fingers touched briefly. The contact sent electricity through him. "I do not even know your name," she said. "Thomas Yates, and you are Eleanor." "How do you know? Your father said it yesterday." She nodded slowly, clutching the letter. "I should not take this. I should not encourage this." "But you want to," he said gently. "I can see it in your eyes." "One has nothing to do with what is proper," she said, but even as she spoke, she was tucking the letter into her apron pocket. "Maybe sometimes it should," Thomas said. Then, because he knew he was pushing too hard too fast, he tipped his hat and walked away, giving her the space to decide. Eleanor did not read his letter until that night in her room with the door locked. She read it by candlelight, and by the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. No one had ever seen her this way. No one had ever understood. She had been invisible her whole life, a dutiful daughter, a piece of property to be negotiated over. And here was this stranger who had read her soul in a few paragraphs and responded with his own. She pulled out her writing materials and began to write. "Dear T," she wrote, "you say you have seen the mountains. Tell me about them. Tell me everything. What do they smell like in the morning? How does the air feel at that elevation? Can you really see farther when you are standing that high, or is it an illusion? I want to know, and I want to know about you. Who are you, Thomas Yates? What brought you to Marysville? What are your dreams beyond sleeping under stars?" She wrote for an hour, pouring out questions and thoughts and observations. When she was done, she had 3 pages covered in her neat handwriting. She folded them carefully and sealed the letter with wax. The next morning, she waited until her father was busy with a customer, then slipped outside and walked quickly to the boarding house. She asked the proprietor, Mrs. Chen, to deliver the letter to Mr. Yates, and the older woman smiled knowingly but said nothing as she took the envelope. Thomas received the letter at breakfast, and his hands actually shook as he opened it. He read it 3 times, savoring every word, every question, every revelation. She wanted to know him. She wanted to share thoughts with him. This remarkable woman with her ink-stained thumb and her hungry heart wanted to correspond with him. He spent the entire day thinking about how to answer her questions. He was working at a ranch just outside of town, breaking horses for a rancher named McAllister, and as he worked, he composed his response in his mind. That evening, he wrote it all down. He told her about the Rockies, which he had seen 2 years ago while driving cattle to Denver. He described how they rose up from the plains like a wall built by giants, purple and white against the blue sky. He told her about the smell of pine and snow, about the way sound carried differently in thin air, about the particular quality of silence at high elevation. He told her about his childhood in Boston, about losing his parents, about choosing the West because it felt like starting over. He told her about the loneliness that sometimes sat on his chest like a stone, and how her letter had made him feel less alone for the first time in years. "I am not good with fancy words," he wrote. "I did not have much schooling after my parents died, but I am honest and I am here, and I want to know everything you want to tell me." They continued this way for weeks. Eleanor would write in the evenings after the store closed, pouring out her thoughts and dreams and frustrations. Thomas would respond the next day, sharing his own experiences and observations. They used Mrs. Chen as their intermediary, and the boarding house proprietor kept their secret, charmed by the romance of it. Through their letters, they built a world that existed outside the constraints of Marysville society. Eleanor told Thomas about her mother, who had loved poetry and had taught Eleanor to see beauty in small things. She told him about her father's plans for her to marry Gerald Preston, and how she felt trapped by expectations. She told him her fears and hopes, things she had never said aloud to another person. Thomas told Eleanor about his work with horses, how he could read their moods and fears, how breaking a horse was not about domination but about building trust. He told her about the men he worked with, rough but mostly decent, and about the rancher who treated his hands fairly. He told her about wanting his own land someday, a small place where he could breed and train horses, nothing fancy but something that would be his. "Do you think it is wrong to want things?" Eleanor wrote in her 7th letter. "My father says women should be content with what they are given, that wanting more is prideful, but I cannot help it. I want to see things, do things, feel things. Is that so terrible?" "It is not terrible at all," Thomas wrote back. "It is human. Anyone who tells you not to want is trying to keep you small and manageable. You are not made to be small, Eleanor. I can tell that from your words. You have a spirit that needs room to breathe." On a warm evening in late August, nearly 6 weeks after they began corresponding, Thomas found Eleanor outside the general store again. She was watching the sunset, her arms wrapped around herself. "Beautiful, is it not?" he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and a smile lit her face when she saw him. "I was just thinking about trying to describe it in a letter to you, the way the gold bleeds into red and how the clouds catch fire." "You do not need to write it now," he said. "You can just tell me." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the colors change. This was only the 3rd time they had spoken face to face, but through their letters, they knew each other in ways that most people never knew anyone. "My father is pressuring me," Eleanor said suddenly. "About Gerald Preston. He wants to announce an engagement next month." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Do you want to marry him?" "No, but I do not know how to refuse without losing everything. My father would be furious. The Prestons are important in this town, and what else can I do? I have no money of my own, no prospects, a woman alone." She trailed off, hugging herself tighter. "You would not be alone," Thomas said. The words came out before he could think them through, but once they were spoken, he realized he meant them completely. "You would have me." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wide. "Thomas, we have only known each other a few weeks. I know. But I know you better than most men know their wives after years of marriage. I know your heart, Eleanor. I know your dreams. And I am telling you that if you want a way out, I will be that way. Marry me instead." "That is insane," she whispered, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Maybe. But is it any more insane than marrying a man you do not love? At least with me, you would have a chance at something real." He took a step closer to her, and his voice became urgent. "I do not have much. I have saved some money, enough to get us started somewhere. I am good with horses, and I can find work anywhere there is ranching. We could go west, to Colorado or California. You could see those mountains, Eleanor. You could have your freedom." "You would give up your position here?" she asked, in a heartbeat. "There is nothing keeping me here except you." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, studying his face in the dying light. She saw honesty there and hope and something else that made her heart race. "I barely know what you look like," she said. "We have spoken face to face only 3 times. Then let us make it 4, 5, 10. We have time. Just tell me you will consider it. Tell me you will not give yourself to Preston without thinking about what we could have. What could we have?" She asked, her voice trembling. "Everything," he said simply. "Everything you have ever wanted. I cannot promise you riches or fancy things, but I can promise you honesty and partnership. I can promise you adventure. I can promise you that I will spend every day trying to make you happy, and that I will never, ever make you feel small." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked tight her whole life. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will consider it, but Thomas, this is dangerous." If my father finds out we have been corresponding, if anyone discovers what we are planning, then we will be careful, he said. And when the time is right, we will go, together. Over the next 2 weeks, they planned in stolen moments and urgent letters. Thomas investigated their options. He learned about a ranch in Montana that was hiring and another in Colorado. He calculated how much money they would need for the journey, for supplies, for setting up somewhere new. Eleanor began quietly setting aside small things, items she could carry, things that would not be missed immediately. But secrets are hard to keep in small towns, and theirs was no exception. Gerald Preston came into the general store on a Tuesday afternoon, his pale eyes moving over Eleanor with proprietary interest. "Your father tells me he is planning a dinner party next week, to make an announcement." Eleanor kept her expression neutral as she continued to shelve canned goods. "Is that so? You know it is. Do not play coy with me, Eleanor. We both know this arrangement makes sense for both our families." He moved closer, and she smelled the pomade in his hair, the starch in his collar. "I will be a good husband to you. I will provide well. You will want for nothing." "Except my own thoughts and feelings," she said before she could stop herself. His expression hardened. "What else do you need beyond what I can provide? You will have a fine house, servants, a position in society." "What more could a woman want? To be seen," she said quietly. "To be heard. To matter as a person, not as property." Gerald laughed, a condescending sound that made her skin crawl. "That is romantic nonsense. You have been reading too many foolish books. You will forget these notions once we are married and you have children to occupy your time." After he left, Eleanor felt sick. She could not do this. She could not marry that man and spend the rest of her life being diminished and dismissed. That evening, she wrote to Thomas, "We have to go soon. My father is planning to announce the engagement next week. If that happens, if he makes it public, it will be much harder to leave without causing a scandal that could hurt him. I do not want to hurt him, Thomas. Despite everything, he is my father and he loves me in his way. But I cannot sacrifice my entire life for his plans." Thomas read her letter in his room at the boarding house, and his jaw tightened. He wrote back immediately, "This Saturday night. There is a dance at the church. Everyone will be there, including your father. Pack what you can carry in a single bag and hide it somewhere outside the store. When the dance is in full swing and people are distracted, slip away. I will meet you at the north end of town with horses. We will ride through the night and be in the next county before anyone notices you are gone. By the time they realize what has happened, we will be married and on our way to Montana. I am sorry it has to be this way, but I will not let you be forced into a life you do not want. Trust me, Eleanor, I will take care of you." Eleanor read his letter a dozen times, her heart pounding. This was really happening. She was going to run away with a man she had known only through words and a handful of conversations. It was the craziest thing she had ever done. It was also the rightest. On Saturday afternoon, she packed a small bag with practical clothes, her writing materials, and the few precious items she could not bear to leave behind. A photograph of her mother, a book of poetry, the carved wooden box that had held all her unsent letters. She hid the bag behind the woodpile beside the store, covering it with loose boards. She dressed carefully for the dance that evening, trying to appear normal despite the butterflies in her stomach. Her father was in good spirits, talking about the announcement he planned to make the following week. Eleanor smiled and nodded and felt like she was watching herself from a distance. The church hall was crowded and warm, full of music and laughter. Eleanor danced with Gerald Preston once, enduring his sweaty palm and boring conversation. She danced with a few other young men from town. She smiled and played her part. And all the while she watched the clock on the wall, counting down the minutes. At 9 o'clock, she told her father she needed some air and stepped outside. The night was warm and clear, the stars bright overhead. She hurried to the woodpile, grabbed her bag, and moved through the shadows toward the north end of town. Thomas was waiting exactly where he said he would be, holding the reins of 2 horses. He had a bedroll and saddlebags packed with supplies. When he saw her, relief washed over his face. "You came," he said. "Did you think I would not? I hoped, but hope and certainty are different things." He helped her onto one of the horses, a gentle mare with kind eyes. "Can you ride?" "Well enough," she said. "My mother taught me when I was young." "Then let us go. We need to put distance between us and Marysville before anyone realizes you are missing." They rode north through the darkness, the horses moving at a steady canter. Eleanor's heart was racing, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Every mile they traveled was a mile toward freedom, toward a future she had chosen for herself. They rode for hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and drink from a stream. Thomas was quiet but reassuring, checking on her frequently, making sure she was holding up. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, they finally slowed. "There is a town called Waterville about 5 miles ahead," Thomas said. "It has a preacher. We can get married there before we continue on." Eleanor looked at him in the growing light. She was seeing him clearly for the first time, really seeing him. The strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the gentleness in his expression despite the rough life he had led. "Are you certain about this?" she asked. "About me?" "I have never been more certain of anything," he said. "But the question is, are you certain? Because once we do this, there is no going back." "I do not want to go back," Eleanor said firmly. "I want to go forward, with you." They reached Waterville as the town was waking up. Thomas found the preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Walsh, and explained their situation. The Reverend looked at them both carefully, noting their travel-worn clothes and Eleanor's nervous energy. "Are you running from the law?" he asked bluntly. "No, sir," Thomas said. "Running from a forced engagement, but nothing illegal." "And you, miss? You are doing this of your own free will." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I am. This is my choice, Reverend. The first real choice I have ever made." Something in her voice must have convinced him because he nodded. "Very well. I will need 2 witnesses. Let me get my wife and the general store owner." An hour later, Eleanor Hartley became Eleanor Yates in a simple ceremony in the Reverend's front parlor. She wore her travel-stained dress. Thomas wore his work clothes and his best hat. They had no rings, but when the Reverend pronounced them married and Thomas kissed her gently, Eleanor felt a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Yates," Thomas said softly, and she smiled through her tears. They bought more supplies in Waterville and continued north. Thomas had decided on Montana, where he had heard about a ranch hiring, and where they would be far enough from Kansas that Eleanor's father would have difficulty finding them. The journey took 3 weeks, and during that time, Eleanor learned who her husband really was. He was patient and kind, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give in their new marriage. At night, he would make camp and tell her stories about the places he had been, the things he had seen. She learned that he was good with his hands, able to fix anything that broke. She learned that he sang to the horses in a low voice that made them calm. She learned that he was a light sleeper, always alert to danger, always protective. And she learned that she had made the right choice. They talked constantly as they traveled, filling in all the details that letters could not convey. Eleanor told him about her childhood, about the games she had played with other children before her mother died, and everything changed. Thomas told her about Boston, about his father who had been a clerk and his mother who had taken in sewing, about how they had worked so hard to give him an education. I disappointed them by going west, he admitted one evening as they sat by the campfire. They wanted me to make something of myself in the city, be a professional man, maybe a lawyer or a teacher. Instead, I became a ranch hand. You made something of yourself, Eleanor said firmly. You made yourself into someone honest and good. That matters more than any profession. They reached Montana Territory in early October, when the aspens were turning gold and the air had a sharp edge. The ranch Thomas had heard about was outside of a town called Billings, and the owner, a weathered man named Jack Carson, hired Thomas on the spot after watching him work with a skittish stallion. You have a gift, Carson said. We can use you here. There is a small cabin on the property you and your wife can use. It is not fancy, but it is sound. The cabin was indeed small, just 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and a sleeping loft. But it had windows that looked out on the mountains, and to Eleanor, it was perfect. She set about making it a home while Thomas worked with the horses. Life was hard that first winter. The work was demanding and the cold was bitter, but Eleanor had never been happier. She cooked their meals on the fireplace, learning as she went since her father had never encouraged her in the kitchen. She read books borrowed from the ranch house. And she wrote, filling page after page with descriptions of their new life, with poems about the mountains and the sky, with stories that were starting to take shape in her mind. Thomas came home each evening exhausted but content, and after dinner, they would sit by the fire and talk or read aloud to each other. Sometimes he would pull her close, and they would simply sit in comfortable silence, watching the flames and listening to the wind outside. Their marriage became real in all ways during those winter months. Thomas was gentle and patient, and Eleanor discovered that love and desire were not the frightening mysteries she had been taught to expect, but rather something natural and beautiful when shared with the right person. They learned each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's minds, with curiosity and care and growing confidence. In the spring, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening as they walked along the creek that ran through the ranch property. He stopped walking and looked at her with such wonder and joy that she laughed. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I can be. The baby should come in the fall." He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his hand went to her belly, still flat but carrying the future they had created together. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For choosing me, for trusting me, for giving me this life." "Thank you for finding my letter," she said, "for reading it, for understanding." Their son was born in October of 1877, during the first snowfall of the season. The birth was hard, and Eleanor labored through the night with the help of Mrs. Carson, the rancher's wife who had some experience with midwifery. Thomas paced outside the cabin like a caged animal until he heard the baby's first cry. They named him James, after Thomas's father. He was red-faced and loud and perfect. Thomas held him with such tenderness that Eleanor fell in love with her husband all over again, seeing him become a father before her eyes. The years that followed were good ones. Thomas proved himself so valuable to the ranch that Carson made him foreman. With the increase in pay, they were able to start saving money toward their dream of having their own small spread. Eleanor wrote stories and sold several to a magazine out of San Francisco that published Western tales. The payment was small, but it was hers, earned by her own efforts, and it felt like victory. James grew into a bright, curious boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's love of stories. When he was 3, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, after Eleanor's mother. 2 years later came another son, William. The cabin became too small for their growing family, and Carson helped Thomas build an addition. Eleanor wrote to her father only once, a year after they had left Kansas. She told him she was safe and married and sorry for the pain she had caused him. She did not expect forgiveness, but she wanted him to know she was happy. She never received a reply, and eventually, she made peace with that silence. In 1883, Carson decided to sell off a parcel of his land, and Thomas and Eleanor bought it with their combined savings. It was not large, just 200 acres, but it had water and grass and a good view of the mountains. They built a house, nothing fancy but solid and well-made, with room for their children to grow. Thomas started his breeding operation, specializing in working horses with good temperaments. Eleanor turned their old cabin into a writing studio. It was her space, her refuge, where she could work on the longer pieces she was attempting now. She had finished a novel, a Western romance about a woman who chose her own path, and was sending it to publishers back east. The rejections came regularly, but she kept trying, kept writing, kept believing that eventually someone would see the value in her words. On a warm summer evening in 1885, Thomas found her in the studio, staring at a letter with tears running down her face. "What is wrong?" he asked urgently. "Is someone hurt?" She looked up at him and smiled through her tears. "A publisher in New York wants to buy my novel. They want to publish it." Thomas whooped and picked her up, spinning her the way he had when she told him about James. "I knew it. I knew someone would recognize your talent." "It is not much money," she said. "And they want me to use a male pseudonym. They say Western novels by women do not sell well." "It is everything," Thomas said. "It is your dream coming true. Use whatever name you need to. We know who really wrote it." The novel was published the following year under the name E. Hartford. It sold moderately well, well enough that the publisher asked for another. Eleanor wrote in the mornings before the children woke and in the evenings after they were in bed. It was exhausting but exhilarating. Their life was not perfect. Winters were hard, and there were years when money was tight. James broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 8, and Eleanor spent 3 days sick with worry until she was certain he would be fine. Clara had a fever one winter that terrified them both, but she recovered. William turned out to have his mother's artistic temperament and struggled with the practical aspects of ranch life, causing some tension with Thomas, until they found a way for him to contribute through his detailed drawings of the horses that helped with sales. But through all the challenges, Eleanor and Thomas faced everything together. They had built something real, something that was theirs. They had 3 healthy children, a working ranch, and a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas gave Eleanor a small leather-bound journal. Inside the front cover, he had written, "For all the letters you will send," with the date and his signature. "You found me through words," he said. "Through a letter you never meant anyone to see. I wanted you to have something to write the letters you do mean to send." Eleanor ran her fingers over the leather, feeling the quality of the paper inside. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking such a risk on me?" "Never, not once, not for a single moment." He took her hand and looked into her eyes. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor. You and the life we have built. I would do it all again exactly the same way. Even the part where we ran away in the middle of the night, especially that part. That was the beginning of everything." They stood on the porch of their house, looking out at the mountains that Eleanor had dreamed about in her letters all those years ago. The children were inside, arguing about something in the way siblings do. The horses in the corral nickered softly. The mountains caught the last light of day, turning purple and gold. "Tell me," Eleanor said softly. "Tell me what the hawk sees from up there." Thomas smiled. He had answered this question before many times over the years, but she loved to hear it. The hawk sees the whole world spread out like a map. Rivers like silver threads, trees like dark clouds on the earth, and everywhere movement. Life going about its business, unaware of being observed. The hawk sees patterns we cannot see from the ground. It sees how everything connects. "Do you think we look connected from up there?" Eleanor asked. "You and me. We look inseparable," Thomas said, pulling her close, "like two rivers that have merged into one." In 1890, Eleanor's third novel became her first real success. It sold well enough that she was able to negotiate better terms for the next book, including the right to use her real name. Seeing Eleanor Yates on the cover was a moment of profound satisfaction. A reporter from a Denver newspaper came to interview her, curious about this woman writing Western novels from an actual Montana ranch. The article that resulted brought more attention, more readers, and eventually, more sales. Eleanor used some of the money to start a small school in their area, hiring a teacher for the scattered ranch families who had no easy access to education. James grew into a young man as skilled with horses as his father, but with bigger ambitions. He wanted to go to university to study veterinary medicine. Thomas, remembering his own parents' dreams for him, encouraged it even though it meant his oldest son leaving the ranch. James went to Colorado in 1892, promising to return and use his skills to help build their operation into something even better. Clara showed her mother's literary bent, filling notebooks with stories and observations. She helped Eleanor with research for her novels, and eventually began submitting her own pieces to magazines. William found his calling in detailed technical drawings, eventually being hired by a catalog company to illustrate their wares. In 1895, 20 years after Thomas found that first letter blowing down the street in Marysville, he and Eleanor took a trip. They left the children, now old enough to manage without them, and rode into the high country they had always talked about exploring together. They camped beside alpine lakes so clear you could see every pebble on the bottom. They climbed to viewpoints where the world spread out in every direction. They slept under those stars Eleanor had dreamed of, so thick they did look like spilled salt, and Thomas held her close in the cold mountain nights. Was it worth it? Eleanor asked one evening as they watched the sun set over peaks still capped with snow even in summer. "Everything we gave up to have this." "I did not give up anything," Thomas said. "I gained everything." And you, she thought about her father, long dead now according to a letter that had finally found her 2 years ago. She thought about the life she would have had with Gerald Preston, stifled and small and safe. She thought about the risks they had taken, the hardships they had endured, the joy they had found in building something of their own. "I would not change a single thing," she said. "Even the hard parts led us here." They returned home sun-browned and happy, carrying stories that would find their way into Eleanor's next novel. The ranch was thriving, the children were healthy and pursuing their own dreams, and they had each other. What more could anyone want? The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Seasons turned, children grew, horses were born and trained and sold. Eleanor kept writing, producing a novel every 2 years along with shorter pieces for magazines. Thomas bred increasingly fine horses, developing a reputation for quality that brought buyers from across the territory and beyond. In 1898, James returned from university with his veterinary degree and a wife, a smart young woman named Catherine who proved herself capable with both horses and ranch work. They settled on a portion of the land Thomas and Eleanor gave them, building their own house and starting their own family. Clara married a teacher from the school Eleanor had founded, a gentle man who encouraged her writing. They stayed in the area, and Clara continued to collaborate with her mother on various projects while raising her own children. William moved to Denver to work for the catalog company but visited often, always bringing elaborate gifts for everyone and filling the house with his restless energy. Eleanor and Thomas became grandparents 6 times over, and they settled into the comfortable rhythm of older life. Thomas's hands grew gnarled from years of hard work, but they were still steady with horses. Eleanor's hair went gray, but her eyes remained sharp and her pen never stopped moving. They still took walks together every evening, weather permitting, discussing the day and planning for tomorrow. They still sat by the fire on winter nights, reading to each other or simply being quiet together. The comfort between them was deep and unshakable, built on 25 years of choosing each other every single day. In 1900, on their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. Neighbors came from miles around. There was music and dancing and food enough to feed everyone twice over. James gave a speech about the example his parents had set, about building something from nothing, about the courage it took to choose your own path. "My mother wrote letters she never sent," James said, raising his glass, "until my father found one and became her forever correspondent. They have been writing their story together ever since, and it is the best story I know." Everyone raised their glasses and cheered. Thomas and Eleanor stood together, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling. They had not just survived, they had thrived. They had built a life that mattered, raised children who were good people, created something that would last beyond them. Late that night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Thomas lay in bed together. Through the window, they could see stars scattered across the sky. Thomas's hand found hers under the quilt, their fingers interlacing in the familiar, comfortable way of long marriage. "You remember what you wrote in that first letter?" Thomas asked. "About wanting to feel something real." "I remember every word of that letter," Eleanor said. "I was so lonely then, so desperate for something more. Did you find it? Something real?" She turned to look at him, this man who had read her soul in a few paragraphs and spent 25 years proving that he understood her. His face was weathered now, lined with years of sun and wind and laughter, but his eyes were the same, creek water clear and filled with love. "I found everything," she said. "I found you." The winter of 1901 was hard, with heavy snows that made travel difficult and cold that seemed to seep into your bones. Thomas caught a cough that lingered, and Eleanor worried. But spring came, as it always did, and he recovered. They were not young anymore, but they were still strong, still vital, still engaged with life. Eleanor published another novel, her 12th, and it was reviewed favorably in newspapers across the country. Thomas bred a colt that went on to win prizes at shows in Denver and Cheyenne. James's veterinary practice was thriving, and Catherine was pregnant with their 3rd child. Clara had sold a series of stories to a major magazine. William got promoted to head illustrator at his company. Life was good. Life was full. On a summer evening in 1903, 28 years after Thomas found that letter in the dusty street of Marysville, he and Eleanor sat on their porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at day's end. The mountains were purple against the darkening sky, and the first stars were beginning to appear. "Tell me what the hawk sees," Eleanor said, as she had 100 times before. Thomas smiled and began to recite the familiar answer, the one he had given her so many times it had become a kind of poem between them. But this time, he added something new. "The hawk sees 2 people who found each other against all odds, who built a life together with nothing but determination and love, who raised fine children and created something that will last, The hawk sees a story that started with a letter and became a legend. Eleanor took his hand and squeezed it. Not a legend, just a life, just us. Just us is everything, Thomas said. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars came out, one by one, filling the sky with light. Somewhere in the barn, a horse whinnied softly. In the house behind them, they could hear the faint sounds of family, the grandchildren visiting for the summer, running and playing and being young. No regrets, Thomas asked, as he sometimes did. None, Eleanor said firmly. Not a single one. This life we built together, it is everything I ever dreamed of and more. You found my letter, Thomas Yates, and you found me. You wrote it. You had the courage to put your dreams on paper, even if you thought no one would see them. That takes strength. We both had courage, Eleanor said. We both chose to take the risk. And we both won, Thomas said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. We both won everything. The years continued their steady march forward, but Thomas and Eleanor faced them together as they always had. There were more grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management. Clara published her first novel, dedicated to her mother who had shown her it was possible. William married late in life, a wonderful woman who shared his love of art. Eleanor kept writing until her hands grew too stiff with arthritis, and even then, she would dictate to Clara, the stories still flowing. Thomas kept working with horses until his back finally gave out, and even then, he would sit by the corral and talk the younger men through the training, his voice still calm and sure. They grew old together, watching their children and grandchildren build their own lives, their own stories. They saw the new century bring changes, some welcome and some not, but through it all, they had each other. In 1910, 35 years after their midnight flight from Kansas, Thomas and Eleanor celebrated their anniversary quietly. They were in their 60s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and spirit. Their children and grandchildren came to visit, filling the house with noise and love. James, now a respected veterinarian with his own grown children, stood to give a toast. To my parents, who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day. Who showed us that courage and commitment can build something lasting. Who proved that the best stories are the ones we write ourselves. Everyone raised their glasses. Eleanor looked around the room at the family she and Thomas had created, at the legacy of their choice to run away together all those years ago. Every person in this room existed because she had written that letter, because Thomas had found it, because they had both been brave enough to reach for something more. I want to say something, Eleanor said, standing carefully. Thomas rose beside her, his hand at her elbow, steady as always. When I was young, I wrote letters to someone I had never met. I poured my heart onto paper and never sent them because I thought no one would understand. But Thomas found one, and he understood everything. He became my correspondent, my partner, my love. Everything good in my life flows from that moment. So I want to say thank you, Thomas Yates, for reading my heart and answering it with yours. There was not a dry eye in the room. Thomas pulled her close and kissed her forehead, this woman who had been his whole world for 35 years. They lived another decade together, growing older but never growing apart. When Thomas died peacefully in his sleep in 1920, at the age of 69, Eleanor grieved deeply but without regret. They had 45 years together, 45 years of partnership and love and shared dreams achieved. She lived another 5 years after him, still writing, still engaged with her growing family. But everyone could see she was waiting, patiently and without complaint, to rejoin the man who had found her letter and understood her heart. Eleanor Yates died in the spring of 1925 at the age of 71, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. In her hand was a letter, one Thomas had written her years before, the ink faded but the words still clear. "You are my everything," it read. "My correspondent, my wife, my heart. I will love you until the stars fall from the sky and beyond. Thank you for writing that letter. Thank you for letting me find you." They buried her beside Thomas on a hill overlooking the mountains she had dreamed about in her first letter. The view was spectacular, exactly as she had imagined it would be all those years ago when she was a trapped girl in Kansas, writing to someone she hoped existed. At the funeral, Clara read from her mother's first published novel, the dedication Eleanor had insisted on including. "For T, who found my letter and gave me the world." The ranch continued under James and his children, then his grandchildren. Eleanor's novels remained in print, continuing to inspire women to write their own stories. The house Thomas built stood strong through decades more, filled with generations of family who grew up hearing the story of how it all began, with a letter. A single letter that was never meant to be sent, that blew down a dusty street in Kansas one summer evening in 1876. A letter that spoke of dreams and freedom and longing, that found its way into the hands of exactly the right person at exactly the right time. Thomas had been right. The letter was not meant for no one. It was meant for him. And finding it, reading it, answering it became the beginning of a love story that lasted a lifetime and beyond. A story of two people who chose each other and built something beautiful together. Something that lasted long after they were gone. Their great-grandchildren still live on that Montana land, still raise horses, still look at the mountains and think of the woman who dreamed of seeing them, and the man who made that dream come true. On summer evenings, when the light is right and the stars are coming out, it is easy to imagine two figures on that hill, sitting close together, watching the sunset and telling each other stories. A woman who wrote letters she never sent. A cowboy who found one and became her forever correspondent. A love that started with words and became a life, a legacy, a legend whispered through generations. And in the end, that is all any of us can hope for. To find someone who reads our heart and answers with their own. To build something real and lasting. To choose love every single day and never regret it. Eleanor and Thomas found that. Against all odds, across social barriers, through hardship and uncertainty, they found each other and held on. They wrote their own story, every chapter, every word together, and it was everything. Everything they had dreamed of and more. A life lived fully, freely together. A love that lasted beyond death, carried forward in the family they created and the example they set. That is the power of words, of courage, of two hearts that recognize each other even across distance and circumstance. Eleanor wrote her truth, never knowing anyone would read it. Thomas found it and honored it by offering his own truth in return. Together, they created something neither could have built alone. In a dusty Kansas town in 1876, a letter blew down a street on a summer wind. It was the smallest of moments, easily missed, easily forgotten. But it changed two lives completely, creating ripples that spread forward through time, touching generations yet unborn. All because a woman dared to write her dreams and a cowboy dared to answer them. Forever correspondents. Forever partners. Forever love.